Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Co-host today, Daniel McAdams. Good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Very good, and we have a special program because we have a special guest.
We do.
Somebody that you used to work with or for. Jeff Deist, president of the Mises Institute. I don't know whether that qualifies him for president of the United States, but I know he could do a better job. Jeff, welcome to the Liberty Report.
Good morning, gentlemen. It's great to see both of you.
I think most of our viewers know who you are, but you, of course, head up the Mises Institute now, but you were the chief of staff for a good many years and had various jobs in the congressional office. So you've known Daniel for a long time and other staff members. But we're glad to have you on today. And although you weren't particularly involved with all the banking regulations, you were fascinated with taxation and the whole program as chief of staff. And you've been speaking out, and you make sure the Mises Institute has, a sound policy when it comes to money. So we want to deal with that today because the news, of course, is inundated with coronaviruses, and it's hard to talk about the problems of spending in the Fed without talking about as well. But the weird thing is, Jeff, I think about when we think of what's going on today is the whole program of delusion. You know, and the book by Mackay years ago, Extraordinary Popular Delusions, and the madness of crowds. And I would think that represents a lot of what's going on today. But Jeff, welcome to our program.
Well, I think there is some madness going on. I think what the Fed in particular has been doing since this coronavirus crisis began is nothing short of grotesque. I think what we saw on Sunday from the Fed was remarkable. I don't think it's going to work. But unfortunately, it also shows that we have failed in a sense. We have failed to help the public understand that what central banks do is not some sort of marketplace or business or economic activity. It's in fact a form of state central planning. I think we've failed to help the public understand that there needs to be a connection between saving and lending, that central banks can't just conjure up money and credit out of thin air, because when they do so, that doesn't actually create any new goods or services in the economy. And right now, with all of these crazy shutdowns by governors, I mean, our economy is contracting. We're in a spiral, but it's certainly not inflationary, it's deflationary. So the idea that if you give people a bunch of new money and credit, when there's more debt in the world than there was in 2008 is just absolutely crazy. It's counterintuitive, and it's like a narcotic. It's just designed to drug us for another 3 months or 6 months or 12 months. And it's not only grotesque, but it's really shameful. I would argue that this is a shameful time for America, that we permit this kind of nonsense to go on simply because we don't want to think about it too hard or understand it too well.
You know, and both left and right, liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats have endorsed the system, or we wouldn't have had it. It's more than 100 years old. But a lot of them will profess they do understand supply and demand and free market pricing, and we shouldn't have wage and price control. But when you come to price fixing, and when you look at the Fed and you look at economic planning, which is what they're really into, and they spend their whole life almost, even though they have to pay lip service to a few statistics, they're a price fixer. They want to fix the price of money, and by doing that, they want to fix the amount of money, and it's impossible. So this is why I have always assumed that this would end, and not because we would get more members in the Congress, but it was going to end because this is not viable. And I just comment on this whole thing of price fixing and how ridiculous it is to think that a couple guys, locked up in a room, let me see, what should the price of the money be? What should the interest rates be? Because that makes all the difference in the world. And believe me, there's a lot of people waking up right now realizing the Fed doesn't have the vaguest idea what they're doing.
Well, and of course, the stock markets haven't responded the way they hoped they would. I mean, they've created huge amounts, or at least promises of huge amounts of liquidity over the past few days. And the stock markets are still losing record amounts every day. In some cases, the other day, more than they lost as a percentage in the Dow from Black Monday in 1987. So this idea that we can promise Let's say what the Fed did on Sunday, $700 billion at least of new liquidity for the markets. That's more than the Fed's entire balance sheet from 1914 up until about the 2007, 2008 period. So it's not working. We've had this concept, this phrase, really for more than a decade now, called pushing on a string. And that what that means is that there are limits to what the Fed can do on the monetary policy side for the economy, even in the short term. And I like the idea that Trump's nominee, Judy Shelton, has actually been critical of this. She's been critical of the idea of a group of central planners sitting in a room called the FOMC, the Fed Open Market Committee, and determining what the money supply is going to be or the interest rate is going to be, or at least targeting it. So it's refreshing that she is at least talking about this and pushing back a little bit. And it's strange to me that even in libertarian circles, what we call FinTwit, financial Twitter, there are an awful lot of people who either downplay the role of Fed, say it doesn't matter much, that this is all about supply and demand, or they actually say it's salutary, that what the Fed is doing is helpful and necessary because of this crisis. And wow, I'd really like to see this thing unraveled and fixed. I'd like to see us on a foundation for a real economy and real money before my own children get much older. So I am not an advocate of pushing this can down the road any further. And if we need to have a painful crisis, some insolvency, some bankruptcy, some corrections, moving capital into better and higher uses, then I'd rather have it now than later.
Very good. Daniel.
Well, unfortunately, Jeff, I don't think that they're listening to you because speaking of promises, I was thinking, Mnuchin announced an $850 billion package, and that's more than the measly $700 billion TARP bill back in 2008. It also includes the idea of sending everyone a check, which is something Mitt Romney likes, send everyone $1,000. I think someone said, no, it should be $5,000. I think it should be $1 million. Then we'd all have our debts paid off. But $50 billion to airlines, we've got to bail those out. I think the White House said definitely. The casinos want bailed out. Unfortunately, those people who enjoy the services of prostitution now, they're losing a lot of money, so they may want to bail out. So they're going to keep doing the same thing over and over again and thinking it's going to work this time. But as you and Dr. Paul rightly know, it won't work this time.
Well, I'd rather bail out hookers than airlines if I had to choose. I will say this, the airlines spent trillions of dollars over the last few years, about 96% of their free cash flow on stock buybacks. And all of those trillions of dollars in market worth on the equity side of their balance sheet has just evaporated in recent days. All that money down the drain. They should have been putting that money away for operational purposes for a rainy day. Is there a more cyclical industry than airlines? I mean, come on, we're going to give these guys billions of dollars. Obama's TARP bailout didn't really result in much of a resuscitation for the economy, giving everyone $1,000. I mean, do we think prices won't just adjust, at least to the extent they're allowed to, because we're now talking about gouging and price fixing? So giving everybody $1,000 isn't going to make a difference. It's just going to create a 1 or 2 day spasm of spending on whatever. So it really strikes me that we learned nothing in that 2008 period. All the same errors have been compounded. All those same mistakes are being made again, and we're really in the same spot. But here's what's worse, is that the total amount of debt across the globe, across society, sovereign debt, corporate debt, personal, individual household debt, mortgages, cars, etc., all higher. So we haven't fixed anything. All of that debt that needed to be done away with, to be written off the books, hasn't been. It's just been reflated. So we're in worse shape than we were in 2008. We need to let this crash happen. I know people don't want to hear that. I'm not glib about that. I know that means real pain for real people. But this time, let's let some of that pain be felt in the financial sector rather than the mom and pop sector.
Jeff, and you touched on that even in your opening statement about the crisis. If the crisis, we just let it happen, things will be better on the long run. But you also brought up the subject that we as libertarians and free market people might not have done a good enough job on preparing the people, and I think that is certainly true. But the crisis is going to come. It isn't like they're going to say, well, it looks like it's time. We need to allow the correction to occur. I think the last time they even touched on that was in 1921 when they thought there was a proper policy, but they don't. But I don't think we have to convince people about bringing, do this and this and this and let the crisis come. The crisis is we're in the middle of it right now. It's going to get worse and worse, and then it's going to be confusing because we have this pandemic, which I think is a stretch of an imagination. I think it's way overblown. But nevertheless, the crisis is coming. So it's back to this. What's going to happen in our job as individuals trying to change attitudes and ideas is to get the ideas out about what sound money is and what a free society is all about. And that's where, I keep hoping, and I become optimistic because I know the Mises Institute exists and there are others. We are reaching people, but I'll tell you what, it's going to be a tough fight because they don't go away quietly. And but I think it's an intellectual fight, and I don't think it's a political thing of when we're going to allow it to come. I think changing this definition of a downturn to a tragedy is really a beneficial correction. Correct our habits, and correct this spending. That is what the job is. So hopefully we do the best, and I hope we contribute to the positive things that we can do when this crisis really gets going.
Well, our job right now is to help people understand how to rebuild a society, a civilization, an economy based on real money, because everything starts with that. And if we allow them to get away with blaming this crisis and their subsequent actions on this coronavirus, they're going to be able to say, well, this was an act of God and no one could have predicted this, and as a result, we had to take all of these extraordinary measures. Well, all of these extraordinary measures were baked into the cake. They're the result of a very flimsy, debt-ridden economy. If we had some sort of stable economy in this country, if we had some sort of sound money, we could absorb a few months worth of economic downturn without panicking and rushing to the exits. So what we saw on Sunday was the Fed groping around in the dark, trying to find answers, actually, trying to create calm in the economy when in fact they were demonstrating their own level of panic. Especially when they take measures like that on a Sunday, which is very, very unusual. So these people don't know any better than we do. They're not some sort of technocratic experts who have this grand vision for us. They're honestly just people who are acting on political and economic expediency day to day. I don't trust them. I don't care for their wisdom or guidance right now. And I think the silver lining, if there's going to be one, is that people are going to start to understand what money is and what it needs to be, which is not a political tool. It's not a political football. It's something that arises in the marketplace and holds value. And ultimately, I think this is going to be good for gold. I think it's going to be good for Bitcoin. And those of you who are interested in gold and Bitcoin right now, don't believe the spot price that's shown to you on, on your, whatever site you go to for prices. The spot price of gold or silver today is the price at which someone will actually let you take physical custody today, not 30 days from now or something. So if you go into a gold dealer shop or a pawn shop and try to buy some silver eagles, whatever that pawnbroker will sell them to you for today and let you have them and walk out of the store with, that's the price of silver, not what they're reporting.
Yeah.
Daniel.
Well, you made a good point, Jeff, about how the use of coronavirus as a cover for this collapse, which you said was baked into it all along. But of course, the government response is to claim that and then to flex authoritarian muscles in response to that. And they're going to do a lot more flexing, I see. I saw a couple of headlines this morning that I'm sure have the authoritarians in Washington just drooling. Spain has nationalized all of its hospitals in response to the crisis. The French government announced that it may nationalize major companies to take control of the crisis. Here in the U.S., you have little tin pot dictators in every state telling people what they can and can't do. In fact, on my way over, I got a text from my brother who lives in Oregon, and his church is scrambling to hold Mass on Sunday because the governor just announced that no more than 25 people can gather anywhere at one time. And so they're facing a very, very difficult time, particularly during Lent, and even holding the church services. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot more flexing of muscles against the rest of us to pay for the sins and crimes of those in power.
Well, they love a crisis. They always have. It allows them to boss everyone around and make new dictates that will still remain in effect long after the supposed crisis is receded. And that's what Robert Higgs, the great historian and economist, talks about with the ratchet effect. So they love this stuff. And I think what will happen is we'll just all get more used to it. We've gotten used to TSA at the airport, even though there's no real terrorism threat. We'll get used to all kinds of health edicts. And that's what's, I think, depressing, even in an information age where we have the digital means at our disposal to talk to people in other countries, to access information about past crises, to know more about what government's doing. They still want to use their authority, and it's awfully specious authority. If you read Judge Napolitano, he'll say, look, even in a health crisis, the federal government is not necessarily authorized to shut anything down. They need to go to court and prove and use due process and prove some sort of clear and present danger. And they're not doing that. They're just issuing edicts, and now we have governors issuing edicts. And you just wonder whether this whole thing doesn't actually make the case for a far more localized and decentralized approach to organizing society rather than this top-down approach from Washington. Because at the end of the day, even if you're Bill Gates or some financial elite, you know, the health care that's available to you, the food and water and shelter that's available to you is very, very localized. That's where it's going to come from. A local hospital bed is going to be very important to you. You know, what food and water available at your local HEB are going to be very important to you, not what some politician is saying 3,000 miles away. So again, if we're looking for silver linings, let's be thinking along the lines of local self-sufficiency when these things happen.
Jeff, a term that I use frequently in Washington to describe the Federal Reserve, even when I was in committee, and I called the Federal Reserve a facilitator, the great facilitator, because it facilitates so much in a negative way for our concerns when you think about the welfare, warfare state. You say, well, it's lasted for a long time, and there's been a lot of prosperity, and a lot of people have done well. And I think this is a catch-22 because in many ways, we knew exactly what it would do. There were people in 1913 that knew what was coming, even though it lasted for a long time. And the one reason why it lasts for a long time, the irony is that in a relatively free society, it still became very prosperous. We still did have a lot of wealth, and we still got away with welfare and warfare, and the bubble just kept getting bigger and bigger. So I think in a way the market allowed this to perpetuate and go much further. But what can the Fed do when you don't have this system? And what can the government do? You can't have deficit financing. There would be a market limitation of it. There'd be a limitation on wars. Everybody had to pay for it. Because on and on. But it facilitates. That's what is so deceitful and dishonest and immoral and unconstitutional, because it affects everything else. And then you come along and you have a concocted emergency with coronavirus, and therefore, trillions and trillions of dollars. It won't matter if the Fed pumps, and then the Congress, spends money. And just think of the trillions of dollars that were spent for the bailout, in 08 and 09. I thought you were supposed to appropriate and authorize money, but it couldn't be spent. So it is so much out of control. But I believe it's coming to an end, and that it is a facilitator. But that facilitation is going to end, and I think we should look at this as an advantage and wake up some people about what could have been prevented.
Well, it's true. I think perhaps the Fed is the most powerful single institution in the world today, when you consider how much the U.S. dollar and the U.S. economy affects everything. And in many ways, the Fed has been successful because, as you mentioned, technology and deflation have managed to outpace even the most grasping governments, at least in the West. And so we've all gotten richer in a material sense anyway, despite the depredations of the Fed. So We wonder, though, when does this catch up with us? When does this dollar bubble finally burst? When does the rest of the world, for God's sake, stop financing us by buying treasuries? I mean, if you're lending money to the U.S. government, I saw today that a 10-year treasury is below 1% of interest. I mean, inflation's way higher than that. So I understand people want to buy treasuries as a safe haven or maybe to sell them later and make money off the treasury, not to earn interest. I get that. But I mean, at what point do we say there's a moral hazard at lending money to this profligate government that will never, ever get its fiscal house in order? It will continue to spend trillions more than it brings in taxes. So this is a very strange time, and the Fed and the U.S. dollar are the two least dirty shirts in the laundry. There's always a flight into cash and perceived safety during uncertain times, so the dollar may actually do very well in the next 6 months or a year because of that. But ultimately, we're making the problem worse. We need a dollar that has some value that we can rely on, and these are very frightening times, and so the best thing we can all do is, first of all, understand the problem, think, read, start with correct understanding, but then go out there and get entrepreneurial. However, whatever that form that takes, understanding what the dollar really is and how it is totally unyoked from anything tangible is the first step.
Well, we're going to have to close out on this, Jeff, but as we do, why don't you give an announcement, at least make sure everybody knows how to reach you and reach the Mises Institute and the function of the Mises Institute offering so much material. That's why I think it's so valuable. And also, if there's any immediate functions that you're looking at now, preventing, hopefully they don't get canceled by the government. So why don't you close out with a couple of announcements?
Well, if you're interested, please just go to Mises.org, MISES.org, and read everything you can. Follow us on Twitter. We'll be putting out a lot of material about this crisis as it unrolls, and we will be trying. It's very, very tough against all the white noise out there, but we will be trying to explain what really happened and what really needs to be done, because we're going to be bombarded with a lot of misinformation and disinformation by the so-called mainstream media, and we are going to be bombarded by the financial press, which I consider just absolutely craven cheerleaders for the Fed. And we need some sober analysis right now. We need the Jim Grants of the world. We need the Bob Murphys of the world, the Joe Salernos of the world to help us understand what's going on. And that's why we're here. So please come take a look.
Wonderful. And I want to thank our viewers for tuning in today. And thank you very much, Jeff, for being with us. And for all our viewers, please come back to the Liberty Report soon.